Hi, I'm Eddie Lane, and I talk about cults. Why? Because I left one when I was 24, and now all I want to do is help someone else leave a dangerous church or group, if I can. This is the second part to the Weibo Ludwig video, and of course, if you have not seen the first one, please go and click on that one right now. Watch that first so you can kind of get brushed up on what we're doing here. It's all about how the Dutch minister, Weibo Ludwig, led a congregation in his years in Ontario and floating around the United States and eventually ending up in northern Alberta with only a handful of followers left. So brush up on that one and come back and then we will continue. This is where it gets really juicy. Okay. Now, we left off in Peace River country. It's north, it's quiet, it's wild, it's isolated. There's something very beautiful but lonely about these towns. They're right on the very edge of the world, as though the north is the only thing left above you. The wilderness of the north is right there. BC, with its verdant mountains, could swallow you up like a giant ocean. You'd never find a way out. It's been logged, fished, farmed, ranched, and most notably, plumbed for oil and gas. Now, at first, the people of the tiny Alberta towns of Hythe and Beaver Lodge didn't know what to think about Mamie Ludwig and the girls showing up in town with their heads shaved. Some of them guessed it was related to her numerous pregnancies. We were thought of as unusual and odd people, she said, but it wasn't a problem. If they wanted something, they were very friendly and very nice. Otherwise, everyone was sort of distanced and standoffish. The Ludwigs gained a reputation for doing fast and excellent work as drywallers, but the head shaving, combined with the religious fervor and the desire for seclusion, soon got the rumor mill going. Stories spread about Weibo having 8 wives or being inbred. Each year, the village of Hythe, population 800, would have a party for the newcomers. The Ludwigs and the Boonstras never went. Their neighbor, Rob Everton, would only see them when they needed something to help dry their grain or to pull them out of the ditch or something. He regarded the Ludwigs as the back-to-the-land hippie types who didn't exactly fit in with the farming and oil patch culture of the area. Prior to 1997, not one story had appeared in Alberta's major newspapers about the conflict between environmentalists and the oil industry in that region, but it had been going on quietly since the early 90s. And as the number of the gas wells around Trickle Creek grew from 1 to 10, Ludwig, through research and personal experience, concluded that the pollution was harming their health. The main culprits, he found, were gas leaks from established wells. Now, there were plenty of studies that showed that the proximity to active oil and gas wells tend to lead to lower birth weights and smaller babies. So what he was coming with was not fairy tales. It was already out there. Probably in the 90s, not as easy to find, but he was already making a case. Along with this, Ludwig cited the high-pressure venting and flaring of toxic waste that goes on in the weeks when an underground gas deposit is first measured. There is undoubtedly issues with flaring and people's health. The methane released is smelly, it's noisy, and according to the Natural Institute of Health, exposure causes headache, dizziness, weakness, nausea, vomiting, and loss of coordination in people and animals. So the people of Trickle Creek reportedly suffered miscarriages, and one baby, the son of Renee, was a stillborn and deformed. Similar problems were happening on the farm with their animals. The Ludwigs felt that they were the only ones really suffering, as they were the closest to the wells and they lived off of the contaminated land, while the townsfolk bought their food from supermarkets. As for the other farmers in the area, they had been bought off by the oil and gas industry for the wells on their property. At first, Ludwig tried to appeal for protection to the Alberta Energies and Community and Utilities Board, or the EPD, which is the Environmental Protection Department. He was not pleased with the response and started to believe the provincial government was in bed with the oil companies, labeling government irregulators as bureaucratic terrorists. How was he expected to deal with oil and gas men who were spiritually and environmentally mad? They began by posting signs on their property, warning workers and local residents when they hoisted a Jolly Roger flag in declaration of war against the industry. Weibo even went to the government offices of Grand Prairie and poured sour crude oil on the lobby carpet. He felt their complaints were being ignored. A Norsen Energy Resources well site was first damaged in November of 1997. and a note was left demanding $2 million to compensate for the Ludwig family. The next day, even before it had been discovered by the oil company, Ludwig dropped off a videotape depicting the vandalism at a TV studio in Dawson Creek, BC. Then at a Suncor Energy well site in Hinton, Alberta that summer, an RCMP surveillance team tracked a van containing Ludwig, his wife Mamie, and 2 or 3 other unidentified occupants as they drove through more than 3 hours of remote bush country. They lost sight of the van for about 13 minutes when the well site exploded. The following evening, 13 hours after the explosion, Ludwig was picked up along the roadside about 30 kilometers from the site. His clothes were covered in moss and twigs, and a hand swab later taken by police revealed residues consistent with explosives. So although they were denying having anything to do with it, Josh Ludwig filmed a home video called Home Sour Home. A truly wholesome way of life is being choked out, Weibo Ludwig says in the video. There is nothing wrong with self-defense, protecting your children, protecting your family, protecting your environment when no one else will. We don't care how many laws there are against it. Morally, it is a thing to do before God. Whether the oil industry deserved it or not, it can't be denied that the dispute had a familiar old ring for Ludwig. New enemy, same old fight. With these vast oil companies taking the place of the congregation in Goderich and even his parents. Groups he believed put wealth above spiritual health and, of course, differed from his own way of thinking. Now we're going to talk about Karman Willis. On the large, prosperous grain and elk farm in northwestern Alberta, outside the town of Beaver Lodge, Jed Willis and his wife Barb raised their children, Derek, Jetty, Tammy, and Sherry, and finally, Karman, the baby of the family. Now, Karman was every bit the daddy's girl. A hard-working farm girl who was skilled with animals, far too busy to watch TV. She was a baseball player, hockey player, and very popular at her school. Her family was one of the most affluent, well-established in the area, and she was definitely part of the more popular crowd. The other kids gathered around Karman most nights to gossip and shoot pool. She may have gotten in the odd scrap at bush parties in school, but that was only because she'd bluntly tell others what she thought. She wasn't thinking about university either, because Karman Willis lived for the outdoors. For her close friend Jennifer and Karman, the perfect day was quadding the trails in the summers or skidooing down the steep Suicide Hills in the winter. It was the spring of her 16th year when Karman and her friends started hanging around the Beaver Lodge high school kids' bush parties. They frequented places like the L, a little spot on the country road, or the Base, an abandoned military complex, or other places like that, country kids style, sitting around, drinking, listening to music. Someone even wrote into the local newspaper at the time to say, kids will party, but do we have to ignore and tolerate the sheer size and lawlessness of these gatherings? So there's a little bit of concern so far, but nothing out of the ordinary. However, Karman and Jennifer were very careful. Drunk driving was an issue because Karman's cousin had died in 1992. So no matter what, Karman knew she could call Jed and Barb, her parents, for help. Not that he was easy on them. One night, Jennifer stayed over at the Willis place, and the 2 girls got in at about 5:30 a.m. Jed had earlier told the girls that they'd have to be up at 6 to work in the fields. Despite the girls getting in so late, Jed had them working right on time. One day that spring, the 2 girls found themselves near Ludwig's Trickle Creek farm. They were persuaded by a couple of local boys, a sort of cheap thrill to get and little adrenaline. Karman was notably scared of the place and did not enjoy the experience at all. It seemed as if a lot of the local teenagers went out there just to get a glimpse of the hippie cult people. But Trickle Creek is quite isolated. It's a 2-quarter section at the end of a long, dead-end gravel road, which the Ludwigs thought of as their own, basically. The houses, a series of tidy, well-made dwellings, were tucked back from the road, and the sign that read, "Abandon Hope," essentially for the oil workers, was displayed proudly under that Jolly Roger flag. It was a political opinion that the locals resented. The teens drove by in the middle of the day. They stayed off the Ludwigs' property, but Jennifer insists they were never out to anger Ludwig, even if none of them liked Ludwig or approved of war on the oil patch. Most of the kids around there had a parent working in the oil patch, so some of them were resentment of the vandalism, some of them feared for the safety of their loved ones, as at least one well had been blown up. Karman's own boyfriend, Brian Peterson, had driven there in '97, just when the Ludwigs were first gaining notoriety for their campaign against the oil pollution. He was looking for a place to fish when he was stopped twice and asked who he was and if he worked for the oil companies. It was no secret that by the spring of 1999, the Ludwigs felt they were under siege by the locals. They had phoned in threats, bomb threats, and just general pressure from the locals to move on. Then in mid-June, Brian Peterson and his friend Chris Morgan snuck out to steal the Trickle Creek Pirates flag. The boys didn't find it such a big deal. It's kind of like a prank, just to say you've done it, they would grudgingly admit, and does have a bit of a college dorm feel. Not entirely shocking, but it was part of what led up to that one fateful night. On the evening of June 19th, 1999, it was typical for the kids around Hythe. Karman Willis, Jennifer Peterson, Brian Peterson, and others were at a party at Cleese's Bridge, just another country spot to drink and hang out. June in Alberta has some very long days, where the sunset lasts until almost midnight. Earlier, Karman had ditched her car to ride around with Brian. They had only been dating for about 3 weeks, and when they were at the bridge, Karman was antsy and bored and wanted something to do. At around 3 a.m., Jennifer asked for Brian to drive her home, despite Karman still wanting to stay out. The girl never thought her best friend would actually venture out to Trickle Creek that night. As scared as Karman was when they had ridden out there before, Jennifer was sure she would never have gone if it wasn't for her boyfriend. After letting out Jennifer, Brian met up with 3 friends in Hythe, Dustin Duck, Todd Vatney, and Kevin McNeil, who all had their own fishing poles. Now, there was drinking still going on at the party, but Brian insists he was only lightly drinking that night. When they went back to the bridge, one of the teens mentioned that Ludwig's place was out by the fishing hole, and they all decided to drive out and take a look. Dustin was well-liked and well-behaved among the other teens. He was a man around town, not one to go partying, but he was curious about the commune and wanted to see what it was all about. He wasn't nervous or fearful on the way out either, only curious. In Peterson's truck sat Cody Murray in the front seat, while Sean Westwater, Karman Willis, and Chris Morgan sat in the back, with Karman right in the middle. Duck was in his own truck with Todd and Kevin, and they both had those extremely noisy muffler-type trucks. They took to the highway that dark summer night, and then turned off onto the dirt and gravel road leading to Trickle Creek. As the gate to Ludwig's property was open, Duck drove up, looked around, and did a quick U-turn in the driveway in front of the main house, where Weibo and Mamie slept. Both of the trucks were headed down the gravel road and stopped where it met Highway 59. "Let's go take another look," Duck said, hoping to get a glimpse of the famed windmill at the back of the main house. Leading the way again, Duck drove straight to the windmill, where he started to turn around. Peterson followed Duck in his own noisy truck. This time, as the headlights hit the main house, Brian says he got the creepy feeling he was being watched. He turned at once, worried somebody was going to close the gate and trap them inside. Just as his truck was leaving the yard, the first shot ran out. Both Brian and his front seat passenger, Cody Murray, knew the sound at once for what it was. "All of a sudden, I heard a gunshot," Duck said. "I just thought, holy crap, man, he must have been just shooting in the air. I was scared for my life. I floored it, just basic instinct. I kept her all the way down. I imagine any person would. I just took off kind of in my mind, just looking back every once in a while, looking under the steering wheel." Now, 3 or 4 rounds were fired into the 2 trucks in total, say the teenagers. And Brian Peterson thinks it was coming from the direction of a tent on the front lawn. He had not yet realized that 2 people had been hit in his truck, but he sped 100 meters now down the road, looking everywhere for Duck, and fearing his friend was trapped on Ludwig's property. That's when Karman screamed out, "Owie, owie, owie." Duck appeared, and although his truck had been hit twice near the gas tank and the tire, Duck didn't know it. He didn't even believe when Brian was telling him they had to go to the hospital until he looked into the truck and saw blood everywhere. Brian called 911, and the 2 trucks raced down Highway 59 to Beaver Lodge. Karman was cradled in Chris Morgan's arms on the way. She said she was cold, as Brian went 200 kilometers an hour to keep his girlfriend safe. The RCMP leader found that 1 bullet pierced the thin metal strip between the front window and the back seat of the cab on the passenger side of Peterson's truck. It left a small hole in the metal, but no glass was broken. It's not known exactly how the bullet traveled inside the cab, but it hit Sean Westwater, wounding his arm and leg, and then slammed into Karman's chest. Jed and Barb Lewis, who were at a wedding until about 1 a.m., checked their phone and found a message from Karman. "Hi, Mom. I brought the car home. I won't be late. Love ya." So Jed and Barb went to bed. At 5 a.m., the phone rang. It was the RCMP, and the worst news a parent could get. Your daughter has been in an accident, an officer told Jed. You'd better get to the hospital as soon as you can. The Willises rushed to Beaver Lodge, ready to hug her and then give her hell for being out so late. At the hospital, they saw Brian's truck, and it didn't look like it had been in an accident. But when they saw Karman, all hooked up to tubes and medical staff working feverishly on her, they truly began to panic. A nurse told them Karman was being moved via ambulance to Grand Prairie, where they could work on her a little better, and that Barb was allowed to ride with her. Jed felt some relief, thinking that it meant she was stabilized. Barb could see Karman was fighting with her breathing apparatus. "Karman, don't do that," she said. She told the girl, but she just stared. It wasn't the Karman she was used to. Her eyes were just dots. Karman Willis, just 16, died before the ambulance could leave the hospital. Earlier, around 4:30 a.m., shortly after those shots had been fired, Weibo Ludwig called the RCMP to report trespassing teenagers. A court transcript of the phone call shows Ludwig telling the RCMP operator that 2 trucks had driven over his lawn. "You'd probably find a couple of bullet holes in their boxes," he says. "You shot at them, sir?" the operator asked Ludwig. "Someone shot at them, yes," Ludwig says. Immediately, Trickle Creek was surrounded by RCMP officers. But the police didn't begin their search until they got the warrant some 14 hours later. It took 9 days only to search the 2-quarter section farm. Fragments of the fatal bullet were later recovered by the RCMP. Lab tests showed the bullet came from a .30-30 rifle. Now, a .30-30 rifle was seized from the Ludwig's property, but tests have not shown that this was a particular rifle that fired the fatal round. It said that ballistics wasn't an exact science when it came to guns like this. So that is something to take into account. Ludwig's version of events were, of course, very different. He said he was asleep at the time of the shooting. He really only found out the trucks had been shot at because his son-in-law, Trevor Schilthus, told him that. On the long June night, 4 of his daughters, Mamie Jr., 21, Salome, 18, Charity, 16, and Isha, 9, were sleeping in a tent in the front yard. Mamie Jr. said she woke when the trucks came by the first time. It was loud and scary, and they didn't know what was going on. The truck left deep tire tracks on the lawn right near the tent that was still evident even days later. Then on the second trip, Mamie Jr. said, "Well, I was in the tent, so I didn't see much. I just tried to stay low." Stay low? Maybe because someone told her to? Pressed for more details, the girls say that they really aren't supposed to talk about it and that they didn't see anything. If any truck left deep skid marks on the lawn, Dustin Duck says, it was from the frantic escape from the place on the second visit, the first being a lot quicker and more calm. After that night, local businesses signed a petition saying they could no longer serve the Ludwigs, and a 24-hour RCMP station was set up near Trickle Creek with video cameras to guard the farm. On a day after the shooting, Ludwig went down to the RCMP blockade on the gravel road to talk to the media. "The teams came close to hitting my girls in their tent," he said right off, "and well may have fired the shot that killed Karman." So just for the record, he was already blaming it on the teens. Now the next day, Ludwig did pull back, admitting that it was likely someone from Trickle Creek who fired the shot. However, it was done in self-defense. Then his mind changed again, saying he had asked his family if anybody had done anything and believed them when they said they had not. "The evidence seemed to say that somebody from our property had done the shooting," says Ludwig's son Joshua, who was 23. "We've told you all about that before, but nobody did, so the explanation, it's hard to say what happened." Officially, the Ludwig's position is that the teens had the guns and did the shooting themselves. Ben's story about that night was that he'd woken and seen the trucks leaving and didn't expect them to come back, but when they did, he was quickly getting dressed, but never got out in time to see anything. "I can't say who shot. I don't know," he said. "I didn't see anyone pull the trigger." Ben also felt that the attention on Karman meant the real issue got sidestepped. The real issue being the oil patch pollution and local hostility. Weibo Ludwig also introduced a mystery gunman, not one of the Ludwigs, might have fired the shot. There's no introduction of motive or how such a gunman came to be on an isolated farm in the middle of the night to shoot at the teenagers. But they did try to reconcile. In September 1999, the Ludwigs and the West County Concerned Citizens held secret meetings to try and resolve the situation. The Ludwigs wanted all grievances aired and all sides admitting to where they'd gone wrong. They were particularly concerned about the death of Weibo Ludwig Jr.'s son, Abel Ryan. Now, the WCCC group, which included Jennifer Peterson's father and a Reverend Chris Donnelly, stressed that the Ludwigs had to start cooperating with the RCMP on the Willis case. If no one finds out, are we going to live with this way forever? Ludwig asked. Yes, said the Reverend. It's one possibility. The community holds you, Weibo Ludwig, as responsible for what happened out there. What if no one here shot Karman Willis? Judgments should wait until you found out who did it, said Weibo. But only 1 month later, October 19th, 1999, the Ludwigs wrote to RCMP investigator Sergeant Dale Cox saying charges should be laid against the teens themselves for terrorizing Trickle Creek and causing such tragedy. Ludwig refused to grant the police any interviews until they had an apology for past conduct investigating both oil patch vandalism and the Willis shootings. Ludwig said they endangered the lives of everyone at Trickle Creek, especially of Weibo himself, and thus had to pay the legal fees in criminal matters. The negotiations between Ludwig and the WCCC broke down, and not because Ludwig made the transcripts public, but because a sign had gone up on his neighbor Everton's property, which read, "Remember Karman," and referred to a biblical passage, Genesis 4:5-15, where the Lord tells Cain, who murdered Abel, that he must confess, even if he fears other men will treat him harshly. You can imagine how this stung Weibo. The Ludwigs put out a list of questions for the community, including how much the trespassing teens had been drinking. Do the parents of these young people encourage or discourage or remain aloof from this riotous lifestyle of their young people? They said, this is like abrasive steel wool on the salt of the wound, you know? The teenage community changed completely. Brian Peterson was in depression. Jennifer Peterson no longer safe in her own house. It's not easy to walk by your best friend's locker every day, she would say. I think of her every minute. If I wouldn't have phoned Karman, she wouldn't have went out that night. If I would have took her to my house from the truck, she'd still be here. Some of the teens refused to say much about that night, including Chris Morgan, who held Karman as she was slipping away. Chris says Ludwig successfully manipulates the media. Everybody has their mind made up, and nothing we can say is going to make a difference. As part of the police investigation, the teens went out to Trickle Creek immediately after the shooting. They separately told the RCMP about the movement of the trucks, taking responsibility for their actions. I wish we had stuck to the original plans to go fishing at the dugout. If we hadn't have went up there, it wouldn't have happened. It's partly our fault. Jed Willis agrees. I was mad at Karman. I was mad at the driver. I just thought I couldn't believe these boys would go out there. The Willis family refused to talk to reporters at first, fearing that whoever had killed their daughter may come after them next. But then Ludwig actually had the gall to call Willis with a plan that the two patriarchs should meet and reconcile. Ludwig thought he could visit Karman's grave together, and then visit the grave of his own stillborn grandson, Abel Ryan. Jed turned him down, saying he would likely throttle Weibo if he saw him face to face. But Ludwig was not done. A Christmas card came to the Willises that said, "Please read, think, and reevaluate and reconstruct your lives, putting God and spiritual values first. Believing in the law? Hardly. Was the family really happy functioning spiritually? Or did the happiness take the guise of devaluation of values?" Another card, also sent anonymously, said Karman was irresponsible, destructive, and full of revenge. Jed Willis, Karman's father, no doubt, wants nothing more than to be alone in the room with the killer for just a few minutes. If she had died in an accident, he could have lived with that. It would have been tough, but it would have been over. But it was no accident. And I personally feel, myself, that Karman was just a normal teenager, just being 16 in the country on a long summer night. But about half the people who know about this case seem to side with the Ludwigs, and half seem to side with the Karman's family, saying that they were just protecting their property, and these were just a couple of kids. On the 11th of February 2000, a few months after these horrible cards were sent, 18 charges were laid against Weibo Ludwig and Richard Boonstra. Some of these included counseling others to the possession of explosive substances, attempting the possession of fake dynamite, mischief by interfering with a lawful use and enjoyment of property, destroying property, and possession of an explosive substance. In April, a judge in Edmonton sentenced Weibo to 28 months in jail, while Boonstra was sentenced to 21 days. One good thing came from that terrible night in June 1999 was that the WCCC, that group of like-minded farmers and small-town grocery owners, and of course, the Ludwig's neighbor, Brian Peterson. That's no relation to the boyfriend of Karman, which I know was super confusing. All were reasonable, well-respected sorts. They came together when the group was anguished and heartbroken over Karman's death. They also knew it was imperative that something be done to tackle the Ludwig issue before things were escalated and became more violent. The WCCC's plan was to work constructively to tackle Ludwig not in a violent way, but through public meetings and media interviews. They took up the pressure on Ludwig, pushing him to cooperate with the police in the Willis investigation. In April of 2000, when Ludwig was convicted of the 5 counts of terrorism and vandalism, the WCCC attended that trial, and the show of solidarity seemed particularly frustrating to Weibo. "When are they going to leave us alone?" was his cry when he heard they planned to be in attendance for his parole hearing. Ludwig dropped his parole bid when he learned that the 8 members had applied to attend, calling them a vigilante group. He set for himself a self-imposed ban on talking to reporters, which was difficult as he so thrived on it, but it was meant more for his family than for him. While he was in jail, he could hardly control the message coming out of Trickle Creek. He did, however, mention that somebody had gone so far as to try to run his wife Mamie off of the road. The WCCC was ready to hear him speak at the hearing. It would be very interesting to have him actually on the spot and to have him answer the questions, and not to have it like you can be in a legal proceeding say, "I have the right to remain silent," said one member. But another says it makes sense that Ludwig chickened out, as he certainly did not seem to like situations where he was not in control. And it is hard to imagine Weibo Ludwig standing before a parole board admitting exactly what he'd done at the Suncor blast, something he'd never done during his trial or after it, or explaining how he was going to help ease the tensions created by the shooting of Karman Willis. He never had. Ludwig's perception that he had been persecuted in the past was, of course, the predominant factor for him. The courts didn't give him justice. The RCMP was corrupt. The oil patch was evil. The neighbors were vigilantes, the media was slanderous, the world was desperate and dysfunctional, even teenagers were wild and rambunctious. After being released from prison, Ludwig faded from the larger media attention, but around here in Alberta, he was infamous. In 2002, Andrew Nikiforuk wrote a book called Saboteurs, Weibo Ludwig's War Against Big Oil. Then in August 2002, an Edmonton Fringe play about Ludwig's trials debuted called An Eye for an Eye. Ludwig was actually at the performance. Now, the Fringe is a weird street performer festival, and I love it. It's filled with drag queens, art students, drama faculties. I can imagine that this felt really strange for the Ludwigs. The actor that played him actually met the family and had a little bit of a picnic. Mamie and the kids just kept staring at him, and there was this sort of passive aggressiveness, but nothing bad happened. In 2003, a made-for-TV movie was produced, Burn, the Robert Raitt story, which was based on the life of an informant who had cooperated with the RCMP to provide evidence supporting Ludwig's conviction. This would have been interesting as the trial against Weibo so hinged on Robert's tape recordings. He had come along to help when his own children were falling ill off the land he owned. The infamous recordings had been made from inside Rait's ski jacket, were very difficult to hear. And even after costly sound enhancing, some parts of his talks with Weibo did actually make it through, however, and they did contribute to that indictment. Now, there was something like a cooling down phase then for Trickle Creek. Perhaps Ludwig had been scared into quiet submission again, like the Thunder Bay Godrich issues. The simmering resentment of the community remained, though. The Ludwigs stayed to themselves for the most part and grew in number. Some 50 grandchildren would be born to Mamie over the next decade. But before all that, the oil industry was still moving in closer and closer around the perfect community. Finally, in the summer of 2007, Ludwig confronted workers at a sour gas well near his land and is initially charged with aggravated assault, but this charge was dropped. His attacks on the wells in the 90s had gained him some serious notoriety, as many like-minded people called it the Weibo way. Then in October 2008, a series of bomb attacks on the gas facilities owned by Encana began. In 2008, a series of letters threatening local gas companies was anonymously sent to the Dawson Creek Daily News and Coffee Talk Express at Chetwynd, BC. The letters threatened Encana to cease its operations near the small town of Toms Lake, just south of Dawson's Creek and very close to Trickle Creek. Swiftly following these letters, local pipelines were hit by 6 explosions, very similar to those that had occurred around the Ludwig's farm and caused damage to the BC-Alberta pipeline. And Canada's largest natural gas manufacturer with pipelines all throughout Western Canada, would eventually offer a $1 million reward for information on this case. The next year, another blast ripped through the Encana line, causing a leak, and then shortly after, Ludwig wrote an open letter addressed to whoever's behind the Encana attacks, urging the bomber to stop, but also expressing admiration. After finding Ludwig's DNA on 2 of the letters, police invited Ludwig to a Super 8 motel in Grand Prairie on the pretext of helping with the investigation. They arrested Ludwig and then conducted a 4-day search of the Trickle Creek farm. They found potassium nitrate, which is an explosive chemical, 75 grams of marijuana, that's about 2.5 ounces, chemistry books, handwritten notes with supposed locations of weapons, notebooks full of information on Dawson Creek, the Canadian government, oil pipelines, and the oil and gas industry. Ludwig was able to explain everything away. The potassium nitrate was for toy rockets, the marijuana was an anesthetic, and that the chemistry texts were just homeschooling for the children. A book on property terrorism was also found on Ludwig's nightstand, but Ludwig explained it had been a gift. Held in custody for a day, he was told that he would be charged with extortion, but was eventually released without charges. In 2011, Ludwig was also the subject of a documentary, Weibo's War, which treated his life in conflict with the oil and gas industry sympathetically. David York began his project in late 2008 and continued into 2010. He lived as a guest at the Ludwig's farm, and the film documents the things that Trickle Creek had experienced through the years. In one scene, Ludwig's home video shows Weibo holding the stillborn infant, while in another, a family member ignites water from a kitchen tap. The film was released to critical acclaim. That same year, Ludwig was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. It should come as no surprise that he used an alternative medicine regimen of vitamin C and hydrogen peroxide injections. He also received conventional pain relievers and a stent in his throat, enabling him to swallow. In February 2012, Ludwig built his own coffin and did his final media interview with journalist Brian Christopher of 630 Ched. Ludwig died 2 months later on April 9th in his log cabin. His last words were a request that his family not quarrel and that they keep their faith. The funeral ceremony was private and the burial took place on his own land. Weibo Ludwig's family wants to continue to push against nearby oil and gas giants. Joshua Ludwig fought an application from the Canadian Natural Resources Limited to drill a well about 7 kilometers from the farm, stating, if they think they are going to lay down in his, Weibo's, absence, they're sadly mistaken. Historically, Joshua says, companies have respected an agreement not to construct wells within a 5-mile radius. But the Canadian Natural Resources Limited drilled the Sourgrass well within 5 kilometers of the farm. Josh Ludwig submitted a statement of concern on November 23rd, warning CNRL that further development in the area will not be welcomed for health and safety and environmental reasons. 5 days later, RCMP showed up at Trickle Creek and were told they should keep some distance in order to keep the peace. RCMP would not discuss the meeting. Josh maintains, we will do anything that is morally justifiable to make the proposed well as economically unattractive for you as possible. A shift away from fossil fuels is essential in the fight against climate change. But how much does he believe in that fight? I don't know. Now in 2010, before Weibo passed away, a gas well did blow out and burn for over 2 weeks near the Trickle Creek farm and resulted in no penalties given to that company. Energy Resources Conservation Board investigators determined that CNRL hit an abnormally high pressure formation it could not have known about because this was a new drilling area. Maybe it was an accident, but it wasn't inspiring much confidence. And the argument that Trickle Creek makes about fracking is by no means unique to them. CNRL insists that fracking has been used successfully and safely for many years in the area and would not affect nearby water aquifers, but this is another of those controversial issues. The Ludwigs continue their off-the-grid lifestyle, but last week a report came in that Brian Peterson, now the mayor of Hythe, is holding a vote as to whether the little town would dissolve and become a larger part of the Grand Prairie County. He says that it was inevitable as the big box stores came in to the area, like Costco and Walmart. The local businesses would have to leave. It seems sad that after this time, the little town would be snuffed out. Not to mention what might happen to Trickle Creek residents when that happens. This finally brings me to the end of Weibo Ludwig's life and story. I want to feel his pain about the oil. I do. I hate oil, but it just seemed to me that after these two parts, that Weibo Ludwig was addicted to conflict. It had more to do with his addiction to conflict than it did about his battle against oil. And when it wasn't happening from outside forces, he would turn and pick on those within. I think it was inevitable that his us versus them attitude would lead eventually to violence and death someday. And I ache that that poor little kid still has no named killer. I hope that someday someone on the Ludwig's farm will talk. But what do you think? I would love to hear your opinion. Do you think the children were in the wrong? Or do you think the Ludwigs were in the wrong? Please do subscribe for more content like this. I have a new cult series coming up about a female cult leader, which is not common. You can check out my website at Eddie Lane Writes for more cult content on my blog. And thank you for tuning in. As always, if you are seeking a way to release yourself from a controlling behavior in a group or a church, I highly recommend going to daretodoubt.org, even just to read about what you are experiencing. You can leave a place like this, one step at a time. I did. Thank you, and see you next time. Let's do it again. Oh. Please send me... No. Blah, 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 blah. I'll pause it.
You're so sexy.
Oh my God, I gotta poo soon.